As much as we like to flame Blizzard for some questionable choices over the years, it's probably not easy designing a game that now has 13 different classes and 39 unique specs. But even after 20 years, there are still major design problems that don't seem to be going away. And let's face it, PvP is super frustrating to play these days. Remember when knowing that you could death CC made you a good priest? These days, you need to be 100% dialed in, even at lower ratings. And there's another problem. Rank 1 streamers don't even know how good the average player actually is. They'll give obvious advice like trade CDs or don't get juked, without realizing that 90% of players already do these things. Rarely will they tell you some of the actual mechanics that really work in PvP. Take interrupting, for instance. These days, it's actually bad to kick fast. Players are so good at juking that trying to be fast will probably donate a precog for free, making you look like a noob. The best players like Chanimal do what is called late kicking, which means using your interrupts super late into the cast. This is broken for several reasons. Number one, people are significantly less likely to juke at the very end of their cast anyway. And number two, by kicking late, you make your opponent waste time by fake casting over and over. Late kicking is just one of the hundreds of mechanics you can learn at skullcap.com, where we focus on teaching what can actually increase your rating. We've got hundreds of videos including class courses, role tips, positioning guides, and a brand new course that teaches you how to counter every class in the game. We focus on teaching WoW from your perspective with our ultimate goal of making sure you improve. And that's why we offer a 400 rating gain guarantee. If you don't rank up, you don't pay. It's as simple as that. To get access to hundreds of exclusive guides, be sure to click that discount link below. Alright, back to the video. One way a class might feel frustrating to play is a complete reliance on one mechanic. And for both Frost and Unholy DK, this mechanic is Cleave, which can make the entire class feel a bit gimmicky in two different ways. Now, just to be clear, gimmicks aren't necessarily a bad thing in games. Sure, they can be frustrating to play against, but they can also make you feel a bit unique, using an obscure strategy that can catch your opponent off guard. The problem with DK is that their gimmicks make them hard to balance. The entire Frost DK spec revolves around a single win condition. Every minute or so, all you need to do is group up 2 or more players with Death Grip, Blind, drop a D&D, and then pop off with Pillar of Frost into one of your stuns as you blast down the entire enemy team in a flurry of blood and steel. This is their gimmick. It's how every DK who wants to climb rating needs to play every single game. The problem is this is all you can ever do to actually win. Outside of these brief moments, your damage isn't really that scary, which means spending time hitting like a wet noodle or kiting away. If you're not cleaving with your cooldowns, you're not winning. Unholy has the same problem, but it's a bit more subtle. Just like Frost, Unholy is very reliant on cleaving too, but needs to be able to hit multiple targets all the time, and not just in small burst windows. The dream scenario for any Unholy DK is to have the entire team stashed in the middle of the map all game. If you've ever wondered why it seems like DK as a class Blizzard can never balance properly in PvP, it's because cleaving can be insanely overpowered. Over the past few years, it's become quite obvious that WoW PvP is indirectly being balanced by Mythic Plus, where classes need insane AoE damage, funnel mechanics, and the ability to cleave in order to be viable. This is a problem we will revisit later with specs like Frost Mage and Elemental Shaman. The other big problem with DKs is that they sort of lack any meaningful way to slow the game down. Sure, they have Chains of Ice and a fairly well-rounded defensive kit, but outside of their cooldowns, they're basically target dummies for the enemy team, taking brutal amounts of damage. And to make this problem worse, some of their main defenses are directly nerfed by dampening, which makes the late game incredibly challenging in solo shuffle, especially if you don't have offensives to close out the game. For the record, we think that DH might be a bit underrated right now. Now before we move on to Demon Hunter, it will be one of the classes we talk about today, which can make people a bit upset. But of course, throughout its history, Demon Hunter has at times been one of the most oppressive specs in PvP. Whether it was during the early days where people were literally playing double Demon Hunter, or more recently in Dragonflight where a single rework seemingly broke the solo shuffle ladder, causing an infinite army of rerollers to spawn out of nowhere. You would think that a class that has such insanely high peaks would be able to repeat its performances across multiple metas. No pun intended. So what's going on? Sometimes it's useful to think of class balance in WoW like the cars in Mario Kart. They're all going to have a distribution of stats. Some cars might sacrifice acceleration for overall speed or control and vice versa. And WoW, some specs suffer a similar problem. DH has some of the best mobility and control out of any melee. And despite sometimes having some survivability issues, they still have some of the most well-rounded defenses in the game. So in order to not be oppressive this time around, Blizzard has decided damage is the thing that needs to be cut. While DH damage is definitely not bad, it's quite clear that big dam is what carries in solo shuffle. Havoc DH will always be one of those specs that will always be hard to balance and can instantly become broken with a single hotfix, since all of that mobility and control becomes 10 times better with high damage. We've seen similar problems with rogues in the past. Their base toolkit is just so good that they can easily become oppressive with high damage. Moving on, Druid is going to be our first class with 3 unique problems, which only makes sense because it can perform all 3 roles inside of Arena. If you've been paying attention to this channel for a while now, you know that we routinely make targeting tier lists, with Boomkin always being mentioned as one of the best targets to attack. Balanced Druid continues to have one of the highest death rates in the game across all ratings, for one big reason. It's the fact that they simply take a ton of damage. Despite having good mobility on paper, it can be hard for Boomkins to actually kite many melee DPS, causing them to take unrelenting damage all game with limited defensive options. Ask any healer and they will tell you how scary it can feel to heal a Boomkin. To solve this issue, playing Boomkin becomes a precog generator minigame. More often than not, you are using Cyclone to peel for yourself. If you are not good at fake casting, you will not have a good time whatsoever playing Boomkin. Balance can also feel a bit limited by its win condition. Incarnation is, without a doubt, one of the scariest cooldowns in the game, representing such a huge damage spike that it feels impossible to win outside of it. Now, Feral is a bit interesting to talk about, as it's clearly been one of the better specs so far this expansion, appearing regularly in the grand finals of the AWC, and being the undisputed king of many tier lists. But that doesn't mean it's without its problems. One issue with Feral is that it suffers a bit of an identity crisis. It wants to be a brawler melee, pushing in and having insane uptime to pump damage, but it also wants to play like a tactician at times, stunning the whole team, cycloning the healer and carving its win condition through control. It's also one of those melee DPS who have to do what we've referred to as weaning, which means playing highly evasive, running around pillars in order to overcome the crucial weaknesses of having weak passive damage mitigation. Playing a Feral Druid requires you to do a little bit of everything all at once, and all of the time. You cannot play a spec without being dialed in. So what is the #1 worst part of playing Resto Druid? No, it's not the fact that your hots get purged, because this is only a symptom of a bigger problem. The pace of the game can either make or break a spec, and Resto Druid definitely struggles when the game is fast. It's no wonder that Resto Druids are struggling to push ratings so far in Season 1, which is one of the fastest metas of all time. Hots are great when the game is slow and you have enough time to ramp your healing well in advance. This is why Resto Druid will always be one of the best 2v2 healers. When there is less damage to deal with, you have a much easier time. The problem with Hots is that they do nothing to help with one-shots. As it turns out, healing over time is not that effective at preventing someone from dying in 1 second. Spam Dispelling is never going to feel good as a Resto Druid, but it feels infinitely worse in a fast-paced meta. Speaking of which, unlike the Disc Priests and Holy Paladins who have tons of mechanics to slow damage down, Resto Druids only have Iron Bark, which is only 20% damage reduction on a fairly long cooldown. The only way to slow down damage is with Cyclone, which is a catch-22 as spamming clones leaves you more exposed to CC, swaps, and interrupts, and can cause a lot of players to rage when their kill target becomes immune to damage. To make matters worse, Resto Druids can be challenging to play with for many DPS. Since Druids lack strong damage mitigation, it means their teammates need to do a good job at avoiding damage or trading defensives high, which is not something you can count on in solo shuffle. Up next is Evoker, the class which in some ways is defined by its limited range. Every Evoker is ultimately forced to play like a pseudo-melee at times, being pushed into the open, constantly exposed to CC. But ironically, the CC that often cripples this class the hardest are roots. Yes, the same mechanic that can torment melee DPS. By some weird twist of fate, Evokers are the only casters which can be countered by something as simple as a Nova behind a pillar, which can completely take them out of the game. Preservation can obviously avoid this problem slightly thanks to its magic dispel, but Prez suffers a fairly unique problem that virtually no other healer has to deal with. The fact that the spec actually gets griefed by its teammates playing spread out. Normally, healers want their team to have triangle positioning, which means keeping maximum distance from each other in order to prevent any cleave damage. Evoker is exactly the opposite. It wants its teammates to stack and take damage, since it not only has limited range, but massive AoE healing potential thanks to its conical heals. Preservation Evokers can actually struggle when their team is spread out, or when playing with a class that likes to constantly move around the map. In general, Evoker is just a bit weird. As the most modern new spec, it can sometimes feel a bit out of place. Sure, it suffers a few less design problems compared to other casters by having multiple spell schools and good mobility, but watching an Evoker play feels like you're watching an entirely different game. It looks less like a class in WoW and more like some sort of Gundam. Hunter will be the first pure DPS class to appear on this list, but with a unique twist. It is the only pure DPS with 2 roles. With BM and Marks being ranged and Survival technically being classified as melee, the talent overhaul homogenized the Hunter class significantly, as all 3 specs gain access to Intimidation, Binding Arrow, and Scattershot, which were previously exclusive to one another. As a result, much like other pure DPS classes, Hunter can suffer an identity problem, which is to say that if one spec is significantly better than the rest, there's little incentive for players to play the other 2. This is something we've seen with Hunters a lot over the years, as BM and Marks have taken turns in the spotlight. The relative ease of playing BM has made it a very popular spec so far this season. It's a classic noob slayer while happening to be very noob friendly. It's no accident then that Survival has remained somewhere off to the side, a spec that very few people will actually reroll due in part to its rather unfamiliar playstyle. Even though Bikmex will dabble here and there with Marks, he sticks to his guns as a true survival main. The entire Hunter class has suffered a problem that we've already mentioned and will revisit in just a moment. That these days, the game is designed around PvE, with plenty of AoE damage ready to break your CC. While Hunters can solve this issue by playing Diamond Ice, it remains an obvious problem for class design in general. CC shouldn't be so easy to break unintentionally. But if anyone has truly experienced this problem more than anyone else, it's definitely Mage. Now we know that some of you out there might have some very strong feelings about the Mage class, and we completely understand. Sometimes it feels impossible to stay connected as they spam root and blink across the map. But ironically, this playstyle is caused by one key problem: the fact that it is often unrewarding to play for CC. Back when 3v3 was the de facto bracket, mages were known for their quintessential 3-2-1 setups. It didn't matter if they were playing with a rogue or shadow priest, mages would play for control. In some ways, the advent of solo shuffle completely altered how the spec could be played, as not only has coordinated CC been harder to execute, but now it is more likely to break to random damage. You've probably heard people saying that CC is, quote, dead, which is a bit misleading. CC is still good, but it is now often too risky to play aggressive for control, which leads to a more passive playstyle. More often than not, your best CC as a Frost Mage is Snowdrift, blinking on top of the enemy team to simply blast people down with Comet Storms, Meteors, and Frozen Orbs. 3 things that would instantly break a polymorph. If there's one silver lining from this trend, it's that the barrier of entry to playing Mage has gotten a bit lower. The class as a whole has often been an enigma, where it's extremely impressive at higher ratings, but practically useless in the hands of a beginner. Right now though, mages are still facing a spec identity problem. Frost is just so far ahead of both Fire and Arcane that these specs have seen very little play so far this expansion. Fire is still a punching bag for some classes, and although not reliant on glass cannon, it still lives up to the name, taking infinite damage without the ability to truly punch back. Arcane will likely be structurally flawed for as long as the game continues to exist. The PvE game isn't designed around bosses and NPCs kicking your spells, which makes life difficult for the one school spec. In recent years, Arcane has only managed to play a niche role, being the Mage spec, which has no choice but to run around the edges of the map all game, spamming spell steal and just playing to be annoying more than anything else. Monk is another class which has gone enormous systematic changes over the years, for both specs. Mistweaver seems to go back and forth every expansion between some traditional caster playstyle, and then some sort of variation on the so-called Fistweaver. In the past, the caster version of Mistweaver Monk was riddled with a few structural problems, which included not only a very long healing ramp, but a reliance on hard casting. 2 things which can quickly become problematic in the speed and randomness of solo shuffle. On the flip side, the Fistweaver playstyle suffered these same problems as any melee DPS, where uptime and susceptibility to crowd control made it a bit less forgiving for beginners. While the new hybrid playstyle has helped solve some of these issues, Mistweaver Monk is still one of the healers that can be easily punished by mistakes. Outside of Life Cocoon, you don't have many strong healing cooldowns, and if a comp is capable of doing cleave damage or just swaps around once Cocoon is used, recovery can become a big issue. Windwalker Monk has also seen some dramatic changes over the years, but if there's one element which definitely feels weaker now compared to the past, it's the lethality of the classic leg sweep setup. In the past, there was nothing scarier in Arena than playing against a Windwalker DK. Getting gripped in, triple leg sweeped, and then blasted with an ungodly amount of damage was the forte of Windwalker for an entire era. For better or worse, Monk underwent a bit of a paradigm shift in Dragonflight, where it became more of a brawler melee spec, shifting damage from burst windows into sustained DPS. The classic problem with any brawler melee is of course uptime. Having weaker bursts means you not only need to stay on target to win by attrition, but on top of this, you need your setups to finish the job. And now with leg sweep having a shorter duration, Windwalker monks aren't packing the same punch. Adding to this problem is the popularity of Paladins. Both Holy and Ret can easily become issues for Windwalker monks, since Blessing of Freedom and Bop can instantly shut down momentum. And speaking of which, Paladins have obviously done very well this expansion, especially after their rework, which on top of some of their other buffs help propel Holy to the top of healer tier lists. Paladin has remained one of the most popular classes in WoW for quite some time, and can be fairly easy to pick up thanks to the linear playstyle of both Holy and Retribution. Having a linear playstyle isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it can make gameplay feel a bit flat at times. The core design of Rep Paladin hasn't really changed in over 10 years. You run to the healer to press Hodge, then try and burst the kill target with wings every time you can. Rep Paladin has always seemed like the level 1 execution test in PvP. If you can respond to air horn weak auras every time wings is pressed, you should have no issues staying alive. From the Paladin's perspective, if you can consistently force CDs, you're doing your job. But if you mess up your go or the enemy team plays more efficiently than you do, it can be impossible to actually carve out a win condition on your own. Repentance has helped fill this void to some degree, as spammable CC will always give you more control over the outcome of the game. But Rep itself can feel a bit toxic from both perspectives, as it leaves the Ret open to interrupts and can feel very annoying for the enemy healer to deal with. Both Ret and Holy also suffer a common problem, which is the fact that they are incredibly easy to control. While other classes have some accessory tools like Reflect, Feign Death, and AMS to immune CC, Paladins are quite exposed at all times, only having their melee kick or Blessing of Sacrifice as options to avoid CC. The linear playstyle of Paladin extends in both directions, where scripted defensive play is what ultimately carries, especially for Holy, who is a cooldown trading machine more than anything else. Lately, Holy Paladins were shifting towards a melee wing style build thanks to the Lightsmith hero spec, but if there's one thing that makes a Paladin a bit challenging to play, it's definitely cleave damage. There is a passive talent that 90% of players don't know about, Light of the Martyr, which gives them a healing bonus while being high on HP. This means if you can manage to cleave the Paladin down, they're going to struggle to heal. Now, priests are obviously a bit unique since it is the only class with 2 healer specs and 1 DPS. Ironically, the entire class seems to suffer the same issue tied to its reliance on tempo. Tempo is a fairly simple concept to understand. Controlling tempo means staying ahead at all times, which might seem like something every class wants to do, but is the main way that priests function. Despite the fact that many players would consider Discipline an aggressive healer, you could argue that Holy is even more aggressive than Disc. There have been times throughout WoW's history where Holy has been the #1 healer for any setup-based comps, as its lockdown and damage makes it great for doing small bursty goes. But in order to become the aggressor, Holy needs to constantly reset Chastise, which requires them to hardcast Holy Fire or smite multiple times in a row, something that feels almost impossible to do consistently in solo shuffle where almost every single global is needed for healing. It's hard to create offensive tempo when you are constantly behind. Disc Priest has obviously fared a bit better on the balancing side of things so far this expansion, but still follows the same tempo-based architecture as the past. There's this weird thing you might have experienced when playing Disc Priest. No matter what is going on, you feel like you're behind. That's because the strength of Disc Priest is not healing, but rather preventing people from dying by slowing damage down. The majority of their quote, healing, is centered around power word shield, using penance as a healing modifier to buff it with a talent called Wheel and Woe. Since so much of their healing is tied into mitigation more than anything else, it's quite common to see a Disc Priest never top their team over the course of an entire game. Playing Disc involves a lot of moving parts in order to stay ahead. Your recovery options can feel a bit more limited compared to other healers, which means it's vital to stay ahead on tempo no matter what. That leaves Shadow as our last pre-spec. Without a doubt, Shadow is one of the strongest casters in PvP, but it doesn't feel designed with PvP in mind. Their burst sequence alone requires multiple layers of hard casting, channeling Void Torrent to summon Rifts, and then casting Void Blast and Mind Flay Insanities to build Devouring Plague. It's obviously a bit bloated. Likely designed around PvE, where your rotation won't get interrupted by kicks and micro CC. Shadow needs to carry its momentum constantly in order to do damage and build pressure, which makes it a convenient victim to melee who can make the game feel unplayable. It's no accident that the most successful priest comps in modern WoW involve either a rogue or feral druid, since having a melee who can stun multiple targets will make it easier to actually capitalize on all of that potential damage. And speaking of which, if there's one class many players would paint as the villain of PvP, it's definitely rogue. It could be argued that Rogue is the best class of all time in PvP, with the community regularly calling for nerfs to their seemingly endless CC kit. Despite its infamy, Rogue is definitely not without its issues. One problem shared across the entire class is its reliance on stun DRs. Cheap Shot and Kidney Shot are not just tools for setting up kills, but are also, in some abstract way, damage reduction abilities. Rogues are incredibly reliant on stuns for their own survivability. If you ever played a rogue in solo shuffle, you already know the frustration of having your partner completely ruin your stun DRs, as now it means another 18 seconds of waiting around, which can sometimes mean having no way to slow down damage from a brawler melee. This is a particular problem for Subtlety, who is entirely reliant on doing burst damage during small windows with Shadow Dance. Although the spec has gained a lot of sustained damage thanks to the resurgence of Rupture, it's ultimately still Shadow Dance that wins games. Assassination is less reliant on small burst windows and instead wins the game through attrition, as empowered bleeds generally do their work to rot down HP. While Assassination can also get griefed by mismanaging stun DRs, it can get punished even harder by any class with dot removal. A Paladin pressing Blinding Light can instantly erase multiple globals worth of damage for the Assassination Rogue, putting them massively behind. Rogue is perhaps the hardest class in the game to balance since its base toolkit is so good. Cheap Shot alone turns rogues into the #1 support class for any caster, enabling mages and warlocks the ability to freely cast. Outlaw seems to be emerging as the best rogue spec for competitive play for what seems like the 5th expansion in a row. The class will always be tricky from a design perspective since it has both a high skill ceiling and a high skill floor. Again, with pure DPS classes largely sharing the same mechanics, there's no reason to play sub when Outlaw is simply everything and more. In the hands of a highly experienced player, Rogue is busted. But for a complete beginner, Rogue can be a challenge, which in turn makes it impossible to balance. If you spend any time reading the forums, you've probably seen people mention that Shaman has a ton of button bloat. And while it's true that the entire class needs a bunch of keybinds, there is an overlapping issue, that Shaman can feel GCD capped, all while requiring ridiculous awareness in order to min-max. Being GCD capped means needing to press a button every single global in order to work. This could include pressing Flame Shock on one target 1 second, using Grounding Totem the next, and then purging a buff, all while being able to wind shear off global somewhere in between, while getting ready to reapply Flame Shock to a different target. The Shaman class is more or less built like a conveyor belt. Everything needs to be running smoothly in order to work. This problem is apparent when playing Elemental, as you need to constantly keep up momentum with your damage in order to win. One of the biggest problems with Shaman is that offensively, all you can really contribute is damage. While it's true that you can play disruptive and even stun players with lasso or land hexes on the healer, it's ultimately your 30-second primordial wave that dictates the pace of the game. If you aren't able to continuously blast enemy players with lava bursts, either because they're getting dispelled or because you're stuck in CC, your conveyor belt win condition is suddenly halted. Enhancement suffers a similar issue, not only being GCD capped, but also being one of the only melee without an MS effect. Now, we're not here to say that Enhance should get one now or in the future, but what's been clear the past 2 expansions is that Enhance is quite subjected to balancing more than anything else. If it's not hitting hard, it's not winning. One thing we've yet to mention is that as a Shaman, you can interact with anyone in the arena in an infinite amount of ways at any given time. To do this well, you need incredible map awareness, paying attention to every single detail in the arena. This can be particularly challenging as a healer, which is why despite having a simple rotation, we've routinely ranked Resto as one of the hardest healers to learn. You need to fill the downtime in your rotation with as much utility as you can, being quick to static field enemy players away or purge important buffs. Warlock is our last pure DPS class, with all 3 specs actually being quite viable at the same time, something which is historically a bit rare. Ironically, Affliction and Destro have sort of shifted roles. Affliction is now the burst spec thanks to Haunt Shadow Bolt combos, while Destro has a more consistent damage profile. We will get to demo in just a moment, but one super common complaint we see across the board is that Warlock can feel annoying to play. As a 20-year-old game, WoW has suffered a lot of power creep, and nowhere is that more obvious than in mobility, where outlaw rogues can speed cap bases thanks to 4 charges of grappling hook. In the early expansions, Portal was insanely broken, since mobility was far more limited and being able to instantly port behind a pillar or up a Z-axis actually meant you were taking 0 damage. These days, you are lucky if your port gets you away for more than a few seconds, as every other class seems to have 5 different gap closers ready to reconnect. Just like Boomkin and Shadow Priest, Warlock becomes a precog simulator more than anything else. Sometimes you just have to sit there and accept the fact that you will not get away, and the only way to counter pressure will be with raw damage. This is also why Affliction Warlocks can feel insanely broken when playing with a Rogue or a Pharaoh Druid. If they're allowed to cast for a few seconds, they can easily swing momentum. While Destro doesn't really need to hard cast at all to do damage, this comes with a small problem, that the spec can seem to lack finishing power. Infernos can help you close out games, but don't pack the same punch as Incarnation, and in many ways, Destro simply feels like a worse Boomkin in solo shuffle. Demo is obviously littered with problems related to pets and all the weird AI bugs that come with it. Players these days have no problem CCing pets even by accident, while Tyrant will sometimes forget its entire purpose in life while standing motionless behind a pillar. A few times on this channel, we've said that Warrior is the most vanilla class in PvP. There's nothing wrong with vanilla, of course, it can even be a fan favorite. The reason why warriors are best represented by a nondescript ice cream is because their role is fairly simple. Have uptime and do damage. If you can't zug hard, don't even try. We could be underselling the fact that at times, warriors have been a sort of utility machine, ready to intervene RMP setups or peel with AoE fears. But in a world of solo shuffle, the task of a warrior is relatively watered down. In many ways, they're like the elemental shaman of melee. Sure, they might have all of these interesting tools to shut down kills, but at the end of the day, they really need to be putting out numbers in order to win. Something which isn't always easy when uptime is limited. They remain true to their roots as the original Mortal Strike class. Simply sticking on a target generates enough passive pressure to make someone feel uncomfortable. But unlike a rogue whose lockdown and burst can routinely convert to kills in smaller windows, warriors are more or less forced to win by attrition. As a warrior, you're not really capable of winning the game for your team, and instead, your role is simply to not lose. And there is a difference. Shockwave and Stormbolt are some of the shortest stuns in the game, which means more often than not, accessories to kills, or simply just micro CCs rather than the game-winning lockdown. This is why warriors are always a bit tricky to rank in our tier list. They don't really offer much outside of raw damage. Once you understand that key fact, it's easy to see why Fury and Arms take turns as the #1 warrior spec. As we've mentioned a few times now, toolkits are so homogenized these days that it's simply best to play whatever spec does the biggest dam. Fury still seems to have the damage lead, which naturally means more representation. PvP obviously has a lot of problems, and we're sure there are hundreds of issues we could have talked about. Whether it's those queues that take hours to pop, or the hundreds of add-ons you need just to feel competitive. Oh, wait, no, we just fixed that. Our update to the skill cap UI might just be the most broken thing we've ever made. In less than a minute, you can instantly install the best interface for PvP as everything is set up right in front of your eyes. And with our brand new update, you can now toggle between PvP and PvE with the click of a button, giving you zero compromise no matter what content you play. Skill cap members can unlock exclusive profiles for both game modes, while getting instant access to hundreds of videos including class courses, role tips, positioning guides, and a brand new course that teaches you how to counter every class in the game. Best of all, everything we offer is backed up by a rank up guarantee. If you don't gain at least 400 rating while using our service, you'll get a full refund, no questions asked. So what are you waiting for? Click the link in the description below and start your journey today.